What Fred Vasseur revealed after Monza left the paddock. Lewis Hamilton's SF-25 not only hit a monumental technical failure, but exposed Ferrari's most serious limitations throughout the modern era. A car that seemed to have several personalities, rapid in classification, but erratic and ungovernable in the race. What nobody expected is that Hamilton was the one who uncovered the truth with his piloting and forced Ferrari to look in the mirror. After the lights went out in Monza and a Grand Prix was consummated that, apparently, had passed without great shocks for Ferrari, Fred Vasseur met in front of a finding that would change the way the team understood its own car. The engineers calmly reviewed the telemetry data, hoping to confirm what they had already perceived from the wall. A solid performance, but nothing extraordinary, one more result that left Ferrari in anyone's land in front of McLaren and Red Bull. However, when deepening the reports after the race, something did not square. Telemetry graphics did not look at all what they had been watching throughout the season. The SF-25, a car that until then had shown erratic behavior, full of rebounds and instability in the critical phases of braking and acceleration, had behaved in Monza as if it were a completely different car. The most revealing detail was the consistency with which the curve traces were recorded. There were no abnormal spikes in the balance, the typical sudden changes of aerodynamic load in high speed or the oscillations in the rear suspension that had characterized the SF-25 did not appear since their debut. Instead, the data showed a docile, precise car with clean transitions and a control level that surprised the engineers themselves. For Vasseur, that was an immediate alert. The car had not changed, but the performance did, and the only variable that explained it was the pilot who was driving it. It was then that it began to be understood that Hamilton, rather than adapting to the limitations of the Ferrari, had made the decision to reprogram its pilot style instinctively, altering the way in which it entered the curves, modulating the braking and managing the weight of the car without waiting for the corrections that usually arrived from the boxes. This was something that went beyond a simple adaptation. The engineers interpreted it as a kind of intuitive translation that only a pilot with 7 world titles could achieve. Hamilton had managed to neutralize the limitations of SF-25 not thanks to adjustment changes or new pieces, but to its ability to read the car in real time and respond with millimeter pilot adjustments. That was the real revelation. Ferrari had built a car with an operational margin so narrow that only an extraordinary talent could keep it in its ideal range. And the most disturbing thing was that the stability observed did not come from aerodynamics or the mechanics of the car, but from a unique driving style that, by definition, was not replicable by engineers on a technical level. The paradox that emerged from Monza was devastating for the Scuderia. On the one hand, there was hope that the car had more potential than it was believed, since Hamilton had shown that he could perform at a competitive level under certain conditions. But on the other hand, it was clear that the SF-25 depended in excess of the individual genius of its pilot and not on the solidity of its design. In the hierarchical and rigid culture of Maranello, accepting that the difference was marked by Hamilton's instinct and not the engineering work was a difficult to digest. For Vasseur, that revelation meant admitting that Ferrari had not known how to understand the dynamics of his own car until the British demonstrated it on the track, something that undressed not only a technical problem, but also an organizational weakness. When Ferrari calmly analyzed the data collected after Monza, the conclusion was as evident as painful. The SF-25 did not suffer a problem of setup or minor adjustments, but was weighed by a design failure that affected all its architecture. The car had shown that it could perform at a high level only in very specific and practically unrepeatable circumstances throughout a championship as varied as that of Formula One. At the end of the Italian Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton left statements that, although brief, encapsulated a change of sensations regarding what was experienced throughout the season. Faced with the microphones, he said with forcefulness, "I definitely felt on the car today and I was really happy with him. For him, feeling on the car does not only mean being comfortable but recovering the feeling of absolute control, that connection between machine and pilot that allows you to go beyond the theoretical limits of the car." After months of fighting a Ferrari that seemed to have multiple personalities, Hamilton described, for the first time in 2025, a day in which he stopped surviving on the track to start leading the fate of the car. Hamilton departed conditioned by a sanction of 5 positions on the grille, which forced him to start from the 10th position. From the traffic light, however, he executed an impeccable launch that allowed him to gain ground in the first curves, a demonstration of reflexes and trust that until then had been absent in his stage with Ferrari. Throughout the race, his progression was meticulous, combining clean advances with a strategic management of the tires. He came to position himself in direct fighting positions with pilots from Mercedes and McLaren, and finally crossed the finish line in the 6th place, a result that, seen from outside, seemed discreet, but that within the team was interpreted as a sign of hope. Telemetry supported what Hamilton had felt in the cabin: a more stable car, a more predictable behavior, and above all, a synergy that until then had been elusive. However, Hamilton's honesty also became evident in his subsequent valuations. After recognizing that he had enjoyed the car and that the SF-25 had transmitted greater security, he did not hesitate to underline the harsh reality: Ferrari does not have the appropriate car to fight for podiums consistently. He admitted that Charles Leclerc had squeezed his possibilities to the maximum and that even in a solid day, the difference with Red Bull and McLaren remained noticeable. In his analysis, Ferrari was in a fourth or fifth real position in terms of pure speed, far from privileged positions. This double reading, personal satisfaction for having dominated the car and collective disappointment due to Ferrari's structural limitations, perfectly exposed the paradox that the British lives in his first year dressed in red, feeling that he still retains the talent and the ability to compete at the highest level, but be chained to a project that does not allow him to materialize it in results. For engineers, Hamilton's words served as a technical validation message. The British confirmed that the small adjustments applied after the previous race and the different management in Monza had had an effect. But at the same time it was a warning. The feeling of control was not the result of a natural evolution of the SF-25, but of a conjunction of factors and the personal effort of the pilot for reprogramming his way of driving. For Vasseur, that was as encouraging as worrying, because it meant recognizing that Ferrari depended in excess of Hamilton's genius to make up the car's deficiencies. That dependence, far from being sustainable, became an alarm signal for what was left of the season. The Italy Grand Prix in Monza represented, in theory, one of the scenarios where Ferrari could minimize its structural weaknesses and maximize the virtues of its SF-25. The Temple of Speed layout historically rewards stake efficiency, low aerodynamic load, and the ability to generate tip speed. For that reason, the team opted for an extremely downloaded configuration, a risky but understandable bet given the context. However, what at first glance seemed like a strategic movement to compete against the versatility of the McLaren MCL-39 and the balance of Red Bull, ended up undressing the main lack of the car of Maranello: the inability to generate sufficient aerodynamic load to stabilize the car in race conditions. The paradox was that, in a circuit where Ferrari should have played in favor of its characteristics, the team ended up facing its greatest enemy, the structural lack of aerodynamic load. Monza, beyond its line, demands a very fine balance in the girls and high-speed braking, where the car needs stability to attack pianos and draw precisely. In this field, the SF-25 again showed that it could only shine in artificially controlled conditions as in the classification, but it crumbled as soon as the race imposed the rigor of management. The contrast with McLaren was brutal. While the MCL-39 maintained consistency and rhythm with a balanced configuration, Ferrari was relegated to a secondary role, unable to support its performance beyond the first turns. The subsequent analysis confirmed what Vasseur and the engineers already sensed. It was not a circumstantial problem of adjustments, but a direct consequence of the car design. The SF-25 lacks a margin of sufficient adaptation in high-speed circuits, and any attempt to gain efficiency in line exposes its limitations in aerodynamic load. This lack of balance makes it a vulnerable car, dependent in excess of very specific contexts to perform. For Hamilton, who managed to minimize damage with precise overtaking and intelligent career management, the result was another demonstration of individual talent above the available material. But at the team level, Monza made it clear that Ferrari could only aspire to fight against the inertia of his own concept errors. Monza, more than a simple chapter in the 2025 championship, can be remembered as the turning point where Ferrari understood that it was no longer enough to depend on the individual talent of its pilots or with temporary solutions. It was the time when the magnitude of the problem was publicly exposed and the team's ability to react was tested. The open question is whether Ferrari will have the courage to face their own mistakes and transform this crisis into an opportunity for reconstruction. If he does not, the 2025 season will go down in history as another lost year, but with the aggravating man of having wasted the talent of a pilot who, even in adversity, continues to demonstrate why he is considered one of the best of all time.